Hello, this is a video giving you some thought about audience, purpose, and context in relation to writing step-by-step instructions. So I wanted to cover a couple of sort of key areas to think about and consider as you work through this project. The first is what the final format should look like. So the idea or the goal is that you want your instructions to look professional, as they would out in the real world somewhere, which means that just a standard Word document may or may not work really well for you. You may have to think through do you need it to be a landscape? Should it be set up in some other format? And so I wanted to go through some different types of instructions that you might think about. For instance, if you look and you take out any board games that you have or that your family has, look at how the instructions are laid out. Are they actually on the board game box, or are they one of those little folded up separate papers that come inside? If it's a recipe, are you thinking a recipe as it might appear in a beginner's cookbook, or are you thinking a recipe as it would appear in a blog online? Are you thinking of policies in terms of something that someone is handed out and maybe has to sign off on when they're hired, saying, yes, I confirm that I understand these? Or is it maybe a policy that is posted on a wall somewhere? I'm thinking particularly in terms of a shop safety policy, for instance. A lot of times safety guidelines, requirements are posted, visible, big for everyone to see. So when you start thinking about how you're going to lay yours out and structure it, you really don't want to think in the terms of making it look like a typical college assignment. You want to think in terms of what would this actually look like in real life, right? And how to set that up. And that means that you may have to get a little bit creative in terms of the overall formatting of it in order to make it look professional and real. Another piece to consider as you begin the instructions is considering how to begin, middle, and sort of end your document. So even though this is not a report, it's not an essay, it's not an email, there should still be some sort of clear sequence or clear start and finish to the instructions. When your reader gets to the end of whatever they are, they should know that that's the end, that there's no more there. And again, that's going to look really different depending on which option you personally chose. But just remember that that same sort of beginning, middle, and end should be there somehow. As far as types of helpful visuals, this is the first sort of project we've done that really requires use of images. We did the resume and cover letter. Some resumes may or may not have included a photo, but really this is the first time where you've actually had to really think through what types of pictures or images or graphs might be the most useful for your audience. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do with this, and this is really part of the next item, which is audience consideration, is to step back from your actual set of instructions and really question which steps your audience needs a visual of. So for instance, if I am doing a recipe and one of the ingredients has something about, dicing carrots, I might need an image to show what a diced carrot actually looks like, because I can't assume that my reader is going to know that. Or if I'm talking about, the internet, and I'm showing, how to set up your computer to best avoid cyber attacks. And maybe one of the steps is going in and resetting passwords or using some sort of password manager. I may need to demonstrate a screenshot of what that looks like, because again, that may not be something that my audience would actually know how to do on their own. So again, it's really stepping back and trying to decide which steps need images. And depending on what it is that you chose to do, you may want an image for every step, or you may not need one for every step. That's up to you in terms of figuring out how to best illustrate your instructions for someone. The fourth part, can tell I've been doing a few videos today. The fourth part of this is that audience consideration. You really constantly have to step back and be like, is this going to make sense for someone who is not familiar with this topic? Because again, in all the directions, you can see that it says that we're designing these instructions for someone that doesn't know how to do it. And so you really have to consider, well, what would someone that's never done this before actually need to know? And that kind of leads into both what I mentioned earlier about the helpful visuals, but then also my next line, which is, says simply, no common sense. You cannot assume that your audience has common sense. You have to assume that they have absolutely none when it comes to your instructions. The biggest mistake that, we can see this, I'm sure it's going to come up with some of the instructions that you find in the discussion this week. It's one of the things that I often see on even final drafts of instructions for the class, but it's just a lack of sort of considering that your audience is not as savvy as maybe you want to give them credit for. And to give you an example of this, I was recently teaching a friend how to make chocolate chip cookies, and I'm standing there, right? They had their directions, they're reading the directions, and then I'm standing there supervising. I probably had to step in and correct them 5 or 6 different times because the instructions to them were not that clear. They don't cook. They're not familiar with the kitchen. So when it said baking, I believe it was baking soda, they didn't understand that that was different from baking powder. They're like, it's both white, it both says baking. They immediately tried to put the wrong one in. There's someone who's a little trying to be a little bit healthy. And so when it had said to add salt, they were just going to leave the salt out. They're like, oh no, I'm not putting salt in there. I don't want extra salt in. So these things that for me are common sense, that when you're baking, you need to follow the recipe to a T. And yes, those little details matter. For someone who is not a baker, that didn't make sense at all. It wasn't obvious and it wasn't natural for them. They didn't understand why you would mix your wet ingredients separate from the dry. There again, it wasn't clear in the instructions. And this is a really basic recipe. It's not a difficult type of thing to make. And so that kind of brings home that there was this assumption, right, in those instructions that the audience would be able to get it, but it wasn't common sense for the person doing it. And so those real instructions were really kind of filling the person who is not someone who normally cooks or uses the kitchen. And so again, when you're thinking through your steps, really remove yourself, because you're going to be familiar with it, and try and look at it from that perspective of someone who doesn't have a clue, who genuinely doesn't have kind of the common sense that would be associated with that particular either policy, recipe, game, etc. So just some little things to think about as you sort of move towards your final product. The other thing that it's not on my list, but it really kind of comes up in several places on here. When you're thinking of the format, you're thinking of that beginning, middle, and end. You're thinking of those visuals that you want to include. Also consider audience in terms of the size that your font needs to be, how small or large the pictures should be for your audience, whether or not it needs to be in color or would be more appropriate in black and white. Like, these are all little things that you can think through. 2 other questions that sometimes come up in terms of visuals. Do you have to create your own, or can you use ones from online? I would say often I find that it works better if you create your own in terms of taking pictures. Now, there may be other images or visuals that can help in your step-by-step instructions that you may want to use, but I typically find that the best ones actually work best when students take their own pictures to include. You don't have to if you use other people's pictures. Either make sure they're common domain, or of course you'll need to include citation list somewhere. Either an APA or MLA is fine, but make sure you're giving credit if you are pulling other people's images or visuals from somewhere else. So anyways, just some things to think about in terms of helping you think through what you need to be aware of in audience awareness, and also just maybe helping picture that larger end product that you'll come up with for this. Any questions, as always, please let me know.